From the outside, George's life looked like something out of a glossy magazine. He lived in the most incredible mansion you can imagine, perched on top of a hill with a view so stunning it felt like the city below was made of glitter. The house itself, think massive glass windows and sparkling marble floors. Everything was flawless, perfectly designed to scream success. Every room was decorated with art worth more than some people make in a whole year. The place wasn't just a home, it was a statement. And his garage? Let's just say it was straight out of a car lover's dream. There were shiny Lamborghinis that looked like they could break the sound barrier. There were custom Bentleys that oozed luxury, and even a vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom, gleaming like it belonged in a movie about old-school Hollywood. And if he wasn't driving, he was flying. George had his own private jet, where he would sip expensive whiskey and cross entire continents like they were just tiny dots on a map. His business skills were next level, and his bank account was practically bursting with zeros. George's name was powerful. People admired him. People feared him. He had everything anyone could want, except he didn't. Behind those massive windows and fancy walls, George was alone. He was 45 years old, surrounded by riches, but the silence in his mansion was loud. There were no voices calling his name, no laughter echoing through the halls. The quiet that used to feel peaceful now felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him. Sure, his money protected him from the world, but it also trapped him in a bubble where no one got close. He was cut off from real connection, real friendship, and real love. All the success in the world couldn't fill that empty space in his heart. And while his empire stretched wide, his world had never felt smaller. It was not always like this. Once upon a time, he believed in love. He wanted to be real, but two failed marriages had left scars that even his wealth couldn't hide. The first wife, Amanda, came into his life like a whirlwind. Back in his early 30s, everything felt exciting and romantic. She was dazzled by the luxury trips, the diamond necklaces, and the endless sparkle of his world. For a while, he thought her excitement was love. He believed the glamour would be enough to keep them happy forever. But as time went on, the glitter started to fade. The dinners grew quieter, the smiles grew colder, and her eyes wandered towards new, shinier distractions. One day, without a big fight or dramatic goodbye, she packed her designer bags and walked out of his life, not bothering to look back. The second wife, Rachel, was a different story, or so he thought. She seemed grounded, genuine, and not impressed by his money. He was sure he had finally figured it out, that this time he had found someone who saw him for who he was. But Rachel had been playing a long game. She smiled sweetly in public, held his hand like she meant it, all while secretly planning her exit. Slowly, quietly, she drained his trust and his bank account. When she finally left, she took more than just money. She took the last pieces of his ability to believe in anyone. After that, George's heart went into lockdown. He became as guarded as the safes in his study. Sure, those safes held fortune, but his heart held his fears. He was cautious now, wary of anyone who seemed even the slightest bit interested in him. Love felt like a trick, a game he didn't want to play anymore. But deep down, even through all the hurt and disappointment, one thing still clung to life. He wanted something real. Not love exactly, not the messy, risky kind, but a chance to build something pure, something that couldn't betray him. He wanted a family. He wanted a child of his own. If you are enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. Then he met Olivia. It wasn't some grand, dramatic moment. It was just a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds were grey and everything felt damp and gloomy. The smell of coffee filled the air in the tiny cafe, blending the quiet buzz of conversations and the occasional whoosh of cars passing by. George stepped in, rain dripping off his expensive coat. He looked out of place in his suit. His eyes swept the room, landing on an empty seat by the window, right across from a girl who didn't even notice him. Olivia was lost in her own world, her fingers curled around a chipped coffee mug. She wore faded jeans and an old jacket that had definitely seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled up in a messy ponytail. She was concentrating and scribbling in a worn-out notebook. Without asking, George slid into the chair across from her. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, though he was already there. Olivia looked up, her eyes sharp and guarded. "It is now, apparently." George managed a half smile. Most people would have stumbled over themselves to impress him, but not her. She didn't care about his expensive suit or his confident vibe. That defiance in her eyes, the way she held herself, made her stand out. "Can I buy you another coffee?" he offered. She rolled her eyes. "I can still buy my own." Then just like that, she went back to her notebook, clearly unimpressed by him. Something about her refusal to be charmed made him pause. She was different, strong, independent, and definitely not interested in playing games. He wasn't sure if it was desperation or some weird gut feeling, but he decided to go for it. "I have a proposition for you," he said. Olivia let out a long and dramatic sigh. She closed her notebook. "If this is some lame pickup line, don't waste your breath." "It is not," he replied. "I need you to carry a child for me." Her jaw dropped. "Are you insane?" she finally said. Her voice was flat with disbelief. "Why don't you just go to an agency?" "Agencies lack a personal touch," he said. His tone was smooth but serious. "I can offer you more than they ever could." She laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. "So you are trying to buy a womb, right?" He shook his head. "I want to offer security. A way out, 9 months of comfort, maybe more, everything you could ever want." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Do you seriously think you can just buy people? That everyone has got a price?" "No," he softly said, "but sometimes people need a way out. You look like you need one, and I'm offering you one." Olivia pushed her chair back, the leg scraping the floor. She grabbed a notebook. Her eyes were blazing. "Thanks, but no thanks. I am not that desperate." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the door. She disappeared down the street. George didn't stop her. He didn't call out or chase after her. Instead, he just watched the door swing shut. He had a feeling she would come back. Days passed. Olivia tried and tried to forget the strange man with his insane proposal, but his words buzzed around her mind like a stubborn fly she couldn't swat away. Her life was a never-ending loop of dead-end jobs, overdue bills, and dreams that seemed to shrink smaller and smaller like a balloon slowly deflating. She was exhausted. Exhausted from barely scraping by. Exhausted from the constant worry that one wrong move could send her crashing into chaos. Exhausted from feeling like she was always wobbling on the edge of disaster. One night, long after midnight, she sat on her creaky bed. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten all day. She looked around her tiny room, peeling wallpaper that hung like old skin. A wobbly table that threatened to collapse under the weight of a single book, and a window that rattled in the wind. It felt like everything in her life was barely holding together. If you are enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. George's words came back to her, uninvited. A chance to live in comfort, everything you could ever want. She squeezed her eyes shut. The offer was ridiculous, unreal, but wasn't her whole life kind of ridiculous right now? What did she really have to lose? The next morning, Olivia found herself standing outside the same cafe, her heart pounding like a drum. She took a deep breath. She had no idea if she was making a huge mistake or grabbing a lifeline, maybe both. She pushed the door open and there he was, George. He was sitting at the same table, a cup of coffee in front of him, looking as calm and composed as ever. When his eyes met hers, it was like he had been expecting her all along. Olivia's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to walk over and slide into the seat next to him. "I want to see the contract," she said. "I need to know exactly what I am getting into." A flicker of something passed across his face. Approval, maybe relief. He reached into his sleek briefcase and pulled out a thick, neatly bound document, sliding it towards her. "Take your time," he said. "I'll answer any questions you have." For the next hour, Olivia read. She read every line, every word, scanning for traps or fine print designed to trick her. But there was nothing like that. The contract was clear, spelling out everything: the medical care, the compensation, the living arrangements, even a confidentiality clause. It wasn't cold or harsh. In a weird way, it was considerate. When she finally looked up, her eyes were weary but thoughtful. "And after the baby is born," she asked quietly, "I can just walk away?" "Yes," George said. His voice was calm. "No strings attached. You will have financial security, a fresh start. It's your choice." It was the wildest, riskiest thing she had ever thought about doing, but it was also the only offer that had ever promised her a way out, a chance to escape the endless struggle and maybe, just maybe, rebuild her life. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a heavy backpack. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely even above whisper. "Okay," she said, "I'll do it." George smiled, not smug or victorious, but almost relieved. "You won't regret this, Olivia," he said gently. She swallowed hard. "I hope you are right." And for the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel quite so impossible. Before anything else, George insisted that Olivia go through a ton of medical tests, and not just basic checkups. They were next-level evaluations meant to catch even the tiniest risk. He wanted to be absolutely sure that there was nothing, no hidden health issue that could mess up his plan. The whole thing kicked off in a sleek, high-tech clinic. Everything was spotless white, the smell of antiseptic stinging her nose. The first day was like running a marathon she hadn't signed up for. Blood test, physical exam, genetic screenings, hysteroscopy, ultrasound, the whole works. The doctors and nurses moved like robots. All quiet voices and serious faces, scribbling notes and checking charts. Olivia felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. Every test, every poke and prod, chipped away at her pride just a little more. There were times she wanted to scream, to just walk out and leave it all behind. But then, George's calm, cold voice would cut through her frustration. "This is the contract," he reminded her. "You agreed to this. You can back out anytime though. No one is forcing you." His words stung. He said it like it was so simple, like she could just quit and everything would be fine. But for Olivia, walking away wasn't really an option. This was her shot, her chance to escape the endless cycle of barely getting by. So she clenched her teeth, swallowed her frustration, and kept going, even when she felt like a puppet with her strings pulled too tight. The days blurred together, each one more draining than the last. She lost count of the tests, the scans, the awkwardly cold tables. One afternoon, after what felt like hours of being poked and scanned, she slumped into a plush chair in the waiting room, feeling like a wrung-out sponge. George was there, his eyes always on her, watching her like a hawk. His expression was impossible to read. It was all calm, control, and unreadable stares. It made her feel like she was part of a machine he was trying to fine-tune. Finally, she snapped. "Why do you have to control everything?" she asked in a very tired voice. His jaw tightened a little, but he responded, "Because when you leave things to chance, they fall apart." His voice was steady, but there was a shadow in his eyes, something that hinted at old hurts and mistakes he wasn't willing to repeat. She took a shaky breath, biting back the angry words bubbling inside her. She reminded herself of why she was doing this, for the chance of a better life. Finally, the last round of tests was over. The doctors huddled in a corner, whispering before turning to George with quick approving nods. The head doctor smiled and said the words she'd been waiting for. "The results are flawless. She is in perfect health, no complications. She is an ideal candidate." Olivia glanced at George and caught a flicker of relief pass over his face before he hid it behind his usual stone-cold mask. He turned to her, his eyes softer than they had been in days. "You did well," he said. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from him, it felt close enough. Olivia wanted to feel proud, maybe even triumphant, but all she felt was tired. The weight of the entire process pressed on her shoulders. But at least it was over. The endless tests and scans were finally behind her. The path ahead was clear now, and even though it felt terrifying, it also felt like a door opening to a new possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better. Satisfied with everything going according to plan, George moved Olivia into his mansion. And mansion didn't even begin to cover it. It was like something out of a movie or an influencer's Instagram feed, only bigger, shinier, and somehow more intimidating. Her new room? It was massive. The bed was huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything smelled faintly of flowers, the kind of clean, expensive scent. If you are enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. The whole place radiated luxury. Every morning, housekeepers moved in and out like silent shadows, making sure she didn't have to lift a finger. Breakfast arrived like magic, with plates piled up with dishes she couldn't even pronounce. Pastries, colorful fruits, and drinks that looked like they belonged to a five-star hotel. Her closet was like walking into a high-end boutique. Silk dresses, cashmere sweaters, and satin robes so soft and fancy that she almost didn't want to touch them. It was all beautiful. It was all perfect, and yet it felt weird, like she had stepped into someone else's life and didn't know her part in the script. Sometimes she felt like she was wandering through a museum where everything was off limits. She was living in a real-life fairy tale, but instead of feeling like a princess, she felt like an outsider. Everywhere she turned, she felt George's influence. The house was like him, precise, controlled, with everything in its exact place. There was no room for messiness or surprises, no room for her to just be. Olivia wondered how long she could stay in this perfectly polished world without losing herself. On the set day of the insemination, Olivia lay on the examination table, staring up at the two bright lights above her, the metal instrument lined up beside her, making the whole experience feel even more surreal. Her heart raced like she had just run a marathon. The doctor's calm voice explained everything, but her mind was somewhere else, caught between the wildness of this decision and the seriousness of what she was about to do. Behind a glass partition, George was watching, his face blank and unreadable. His arms were folded and his posture was rigid, like he was trying to hold all his emotions together. On the surface, it looked like he had it all figured out, but underneath, it was a tangle of worry and what-if scenarios. This was the moment that months of planning and endless tests had led to. Was it actually going to work? The doctor walked quietly, efficiently, and before Olivia knew it, it was over. The procedure itself only took a few minutes, but to her, it felt like forever. She sat up slowly, pulling her gown back into place. "We'll know in a few weeks," the doctor said gently, like he didn't want to disturb the fragile silence that had settled over them. The days that followed dragged on endlessly. The mansion had everything she could ever need, but it felt like a golden cage. Olivia wandered through the house trying to keep busy, but no matter what she did, the uncertainty clung to her like a shadow. George kept his distance. He wasn't cold or rude, but it was like he was afraid that if he hovered too closely, he might break the thin thread of hope they were both holding onto. Instead, he spent his time checking in with the doctor and pretending he wasn't just as anxious as she was. Meanwhile, every glance at the calendar made Olivia's stomach twist. Every tick of the clock felt like it was mocking her. Her mind swung between hope and dread, and no amount of designer clothes or luxurious meals could distract her from the endless what-ifs. She reminded herself over and over that this was just a job, just a deal she had made. But sometimes, in the quiet moment, she couldn't help but wonder if she had given away more than just 9 months of her life. Then one morning, the call came. The doctor's voice on the other end of the phone was clear and certain. "Congratulations, you are pregnant." Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, her hand clutching the phone so tightly it hurt. The words echoed in her mind, but they felt strangely hollow. There was no fairy tale excitement, no happy tears. This wasn't some dreamy family moment. It was a result of a contract, a deal fulfilled. She took a shaky breath and headed downstairs, her heart pounding. When she found George, he was standing by the window, lost in thought. She cleared her throat, and he turned towards her. For a second, everything was still. His face, usually so cold and guarded, was softened. His eyes widened, and his lips parted in surprise. The walls he always kept up seemed to crack just a little. And for once, she saw something vulnerable, something real. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but the words carry a weight settling between them like an unspoken promise. In that fragile moment, everything felt a little less like a deal and a little more like a shared hope. The weeks that followed felt like balancing a tightrope high above the ground with no safety net. George made sure Olivia had the best prenatal care money could buy. Every appointment took place in a fancy, ultra-private clinic where no one asked questions or gave curious glances. But even with all the luxury and calm surroundings, the tension was impossible to ignore. On the first day of the ultrasound, Olivia lay on the exam table, the cold gel sending a chill across her belly. The room felt too quiet. Then a sound, soft, rapid, almost like the flutter of tiny wings, a heartbeat. It was so fast, so delicate, yet it filled the room completely. George froze, his breath caught, and his chest tightened with a feeling he hadn't expected. It was overwhelming. It was almost painful, and a terrifying thought whispered through his mind. Is this happiness? Is this what hope feels like? He turned to look at Olivia. Her eyes were shining with tears, her mouth open in awe. For a moment, the walls between them melted away. They weren't two people stuck in a cold agreement. They were two people standing on the edge of a miracle, fragile and breathtakingly real. As the months passed, Olivia's belly grew rounder, a visible sign of the life blossoming inside her. The mansion, which once felt like a cold, intimidating castle, started to feel different and warmer, more like home. It wasn't an overnight change. It happened in tiny moments, in quiet exchanges that neither of them had planned. George, who swore he would keep things professional and distant. If you are enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. Found himself drawn to Olivia's sarcastic humor and quiet strength. She challenged him, teased him, and somehow, without even trying, she chipped away at the icy armor he had spent years building. They spent evenings together by the fireplace, Olivia curled up in a giant armchair and George next to her, swirling a glass of whiskey. At first, the conversations were small, stuff about books, the weird habits of the housekeepers, the weather, but those small talks turned into something deeper, like cracks spreading across a sheet of ice. One night, as the fire crackled softly, Olivia glanced at him with a curious eyes. You know, for someone who likes to control everything, you don't seem to have a plan for after the baby is born. George looked away. The plan is for you to have a fresh start. That's what you wanted, right? Olivia didn't answer right away. She just studied him, her gaze serious. Maybe, but I think you are fooling yourself if you believe this is just business. Her words hit him harder than he let on. That night, long after Olivia had gone to bed, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her voice echoed in his mind. Had he been so obsessed with control that he'd missed what he really needed? Was he trying to build a legacy, or was he just trying to fill the emptiness inside him? As Olivia's due date drew closer, George wrestled with those questions. The lines between their contract blurred so much they felt impossible to separate. His need for control and the rules he had set so firmly all started to feel pointless. For the first time in forever, he wondered, just maybe, letting go a little was the key to finding the connection he hadn't even realized he was searching for. Maybe control wasn't the answer. Maybe what he needed was standing right in front of him, laughing at his stubbornness, teasing him when he got too serious, and growing a new life that was about to change everything. And that thought, terrifying and beautiful, was enough to make him wonder if fate had a better plan than he did. If you are enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. One night, under the watchful eyes of the housekeepers, Olivia's waters broke and she went into labor. The ride to the hospital was a whirlwind of pain and noise. Her contractions came faster, each one a wave of pressure and agony. The paramedics reassured her, checked her vitals, and prepared her for the imminent birth. By the time they reached the hospital, Olivia was ready. The delivery room was a blur of bright light and urgent movements. She gripped the sides of the bed as the doctor's calm voice guided her through the final moments. You are doing great, Olivia. Just one more push. With a final cry, she gave everything she had left. Then the world went still. "It's a girl," the doctor announced. Olivia's heart clenched as she saw her daughter for the first time. Her skin was soft and pink. She was perfect. The baby was cleaned up and handed over to George, whilst Olivia was being cleaned up. When he looked down at the baby, his stoic mask cracked. Tears filled his eyes as he gently took the tiny girl in his arms. She opened her eyes briefly, and in that fleeting moment, the weight of the world shifted. "Thank you," he said to Olivia. His voice was raw, and for the first time, it looked like he truly meant it. Olivia watched him, her heart aching. She had promised herself this was just a job, a contract to be fulfilled. But as she looked at her daughter, so fragile and beautiful, something inside her began to unravel. She loved her too much. The days in the hospital felt like a blur, a mix of exhaustion and emotions too big to explain. George was always nearby, never straying far from his daughter. He held her carefully, like she was made of glass, his eyes filled with a protectiveness that didn't match his usual cold exterior. Olivia held the baby every chance she got, memorizing everything, the way her tiny fingers curled around hers, the soft warmth of her skin, the peaceful rise and fall of her breath. She wanted to freeze those moments in time, to keep them forever. But in the back of her mind, the deal, the contract, loomed like a storm cloud. A few weeks later, back at the mansion, the moment she'd been dreading arrived. Her bags were packed, the terms of the agreement were fulfilled. Olivia stood in her room, staring at her suitcases, tears welling up in her eyes. Her heart screamed at her to stay, but her brain reminded her this was the plan. With a shaky breath, she called the helpers to help her with her bags, and she made her way downstairs. George was in the living room, cradling the baby gently. He looked up when she entered. His face was blank, but his eyes were softer and almost sad. "You are leaving," he said quietly. She nodded, wiping a tear that escaped down her cheek. That was the plan, remember? He looked down at the baby, his jaw clenching slightly. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with everything they wanted to say but couldn't. Suddenly, he spoke. His voice trembled just a little. "Wait, stay a little longer. For her sake," he paused, then his eyes meeting hers. "For my sake too." She was caught unawares. The walls she'd built around her heart started to crack. She looked at George, the man who used to seem so cold and unreachable, and saw something different now. They weren't just tied by a piece of paper. They were tied together by the tiny, beautiful life they had brought into the world. Olivia stepped closer to look at the baby sleeping. Olivia's heart squeezed with a love so deep it felt like it might break her. "We can't keep calling her baby, you know," Olivia whispered with a soft smile. George chuckled under his breath, his eyes still on the baby. There was a warmth in his gaze that still surprised her. "You are right. She needs a name as beautiful as she is." Olivia tilted her head, thinking, "I've always liked vintage names. Something classic, something that lasts." George nodded, his eyes distant like he was remembering something from long ago. His voice was so quiet when he spoke. "What about Aurora?" Olivia's eyes lit up. She whispered it, testing the sound. "Aurora? A smile spread across her face. "Like the dawn, and we can call her Rory for short," George added. Olivia reached out and brushed her fingers over the baby's tiny hand. "It's perfect." George's gaze softened as he whispered the name again. "Aurora." The words seemed to light up the room, like a promise of hope and new beginnings. For a moment, they sat together in silence, letting the name settle over them. It felt right, like naming her had tied them to something bigger, something real. Olivia leaned her head against George's shoulder, "Welcome to the world, Aurora," she whispered. George wrapped his arm around both of them, his heart fuller than he ever thought it could be. For the first time, control didn't matter. What mattered was the delicate, precious connection they had created, a bond they had never expected but could not deny. In that moment, they weren't just two people following a contract. They were something more. They were a family. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'll see you in the next one.